Now let's implement the rest of these controller methods, because by doing so you will learn a lot about how a DB context works and how you can use a DB set to implement all your CRUD operations. So let's start with the easiest one, and that is this get method that fetches a single item by its ID. Now there are many LINQ extension methods that allow us to query a DB set. Now let's start with this one because it's a rather simple one. So if I'm just going to go fetch a single movie, I'm going to get it out of my DB context and I'm going to get it out of the movie's DB set. Now the DB set acts as a repository that you can use to fetch items, to query items, to add new items or update existing ones. So all of these extension methods are on top of the DB set. Now I have this DB set, and what I can actually do is I can do first, and first takes a predicate. A predicate means that that's a function that matches an item or not, so it returns a boolean. You can make predicates with lambdas or you could use functions, it doesn't matter. So I'm going to use the ID of this item. ID equals the ID that we're getting from our root. And this will actually give us the movie to return. Now the problem with first is that it throws an exception if it doesn't find an item in the database. But what we're after is we want to return a clean status 404 not found. So in order to do that, there is another extension method, and that's how these two differ. First will actually throw an exception. First or default will return NULL if it doesn't find anything. That is what the or default part means. Now, there is obviously, we are in an asynchronous method and a round trip to a database should be awaited. So obviously there are async signatures for all of these as well. So I can just go await this and that fetches a movie. And now I have NULL if I don't have an item in my database. Now I can just go return movie. If my movie is null, I'm going to return the not found result, which is the 404 not found that we are after. If I do have a movie, I'm just going to return a 200 OK with the body contents being our actual movie. And that completes this controller method. But there is a little bit more to be said about this first or default, because there are other options. We can look at this one will actually always hit the database and it will return the first match that it found. But what happens if there are two matches in our database with the same identifier? That's maybe something we want to check as well. Because in this case, I'm actually expecting a single result. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to leave this here. I'm going to show you there is also a single or default. Now the single or default will actually check if there are multiple items in the database, and it will throw an exception if we find more than one. So it behaves exactly like the first or default, but if there are two or more matches in the database, that will actually throw an exception. Now there is a last way to fetch a single item in this scenario, and that is by using the find method. And the find method actually behaves a tiny bit differently from the other two. So what we can do here is if we use find, I'm going to do var movie is, and then we start from our DB set again, .movies.find. And find doesn't take a predicate, but find takes an identifier. And find is the method that looks an item up by its primary key. Obviously, there is a find async, which we can await. And this method will do the same as the above, unless this DB context has already fetched this particular entity with this particular ID from the database. In which case the entity is going to be in memory, it's going to be an object in memory, and the DB context will return just that one entity from memory. You will win a lot of speed because it doesn't need to round trip to the database, but you do this at the risk of serving stale data. Now, in this case, all three of these, because we're looking by an actual primary key, all of these, three of these will behave exactly the same, but in certain scenarios, you're going to want to pick one over the other. So this one actually, if I need to add an explanation to it, it will it will serve from memory if it's already there, and otherwise it will hit the database just like the functions above. So that's all there is to be said about the get method. Let's move on to the create. For this method, we are going to be creating a new item in the database, and luckily ASP.NET is already giving us a proper movie object, which is just a deserialized version from the request body of this method. Now, we can just use the repository pattern on the DB set to add it to our database, and as all the above, this is an awaitable method. We can use the DB set and we can call the add method on it. And the add method is going to take a movie object. So we can pass our movie into it. Now, at this point, nothing has happened yet. Nothing has been saved to the database. And that's because the DB context implements a unit of work pattern. So all of the changes that you do, all the creates, all the updates, all the deletes, they are queued until the moment that you are ready to persist them into the database. And for that, we have a method that we can call on the DB context as well. So that method is called save changes, and without the typo, obviously, save changes async. And that will persist all the queued changes into the database. What this will do is it will create a transaction on the connection that it has with the database. It will execute all of the changes and then commit the transaction. So that is what the save changes will do for us. Now, another cool thing has happened in the background, and we haven't really noticed it yet, but if we use the created add to actually return a proper created result because we are expecting a 201 created, something cool will pop up as well. Because at this point, because we haven't submitted anything to the database yet, our movie object does not have an ID. And what Entity Framework does is if we're creating new entities, we are actually adding the ID to the entity automatically. Entity Framework does this for us. So after we call the save changes, the ID property on this object will be set. So the way that that works is it'll either fetch it back from the database if the ID gets generated there, or it will be generated in memory if we are generating the IDs on the client side. We'll get back to what that means in one of the future chapters. All you have to know is if you create a new item, after calling the save changes, it will actually have an ID. And the way that we actually do this with ASP.NET, we are going to tell the caller where the item has been created and what it looks like. And for that, we use the created add action method to do that properly. The created add action method takes a couple of parameters. First, you're going to tell it which method you need to actually call to actually fetch the movie that you just created. So you're going to use the name of the get method for that. Then we're going to pass in the parameters that this method needs. So we need, as we can see up here, we need an ID. So we're just going to pass that in. We will create an anonymous object where the ID property is set to the ID that we need. In our case, that is movie.id, which is now set. So that works beautifully. We also have the option to return the full movie object as it was created back to the user. That is the last parameter of this method. You don't have to remember all that. It doesn't have much to do with Entity Framework, but that gives us a clean create method. Now let me demo how that actually works. So I'm going to put a breakpoint right here so that you can see that the movie doesn't have an ID when we get to that point. So I've created a movie I have one ready that we can use to try this out. So as soon as this starts up, we can actually call the post method, and we are going to pass in a movie that I like very much, which is Fight Club. And by passing this in, this is valid and this doesn't have an ID. By passing this in, we will actually call this post method. And we're getting here, and as you can see, I've already added it to the DB set, but my movie object at this point does not have an ID. The ID is still 0. Now, after the save changes, I'm just going to step one step further in our execution. If I go and look back at our movie, it does have an ID. And because it's the first one that's being created in our database, it is going to have ID 1. So when we let the rest of our execution play out, we can go back to our browser and look at what has happened with that response. And what we're getting is we're getting our full movie as expected with a proper ID set to 1. And we are getting this location where the user can fetch back this entity if they would need to fetch it again in the future. Entity Framework made that real easy for us by setting the ID to the method